Welcome to BWI Live. I'm Thomas Frank Carr. So many weird things happening today. Some good weird things and some just weird things. Like, this is supposed to be the recruiting show. But here's the thing. When both of your recruiting insiders have conflicts, you don't have much of a recruiting show. So we're doing the old flip-flop switcheroo. Today we're going to do our BWI Live football show. And then Wednesday we're going to have our recruiting show with Ryan and with Fitz. All kinds of great stuff coming up this week. From Blue White Illustrated. It's July. Things are heating up, and we've got our experts in to talk about all of that. Greg Pickel, reporter for Blue White Illustrated, and Nate Bauer, he is our senior editor at BWI. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Nate, did you get any golfing in this weekend? Always got to get our start of the show golf update.
First of all, I'm just a little disappointed that you don't trust me to participate in a recruiting show.
Nate, what's the latest with Liam Andrews?
He's a player he plays football.
Go on.
He's a football player. And, okay, yeah, no, you got me. Me.
That's fair enough. Fair enough.
Not my forte.
Well, your forte is Penn State basketball, which we're going to be talking about today. Also, part of what's coming up this week, we are going to be doing a hoops show. So that's going to be coming up on Wednesday evening, and of course, wherever you get your podcasts. So put that on your calendar. Greg Pickel, we're talking about wrestling with him today, but all of that, it pales in comparison to what's on your mind. Coming up today at the end of the show, the BWI Mailbag, because we did the whole switcheroo. We don't have as many questions from the Lions Den as we normally would, which is we have 0 today. So if you want to get your question on the mailbag, it is wide open for you. Drop your questions in the chat. We'll get to the best ones a little bit later in the show. Also coming up today, we're going to be talking about NIL, James Franklin's latest comments, and a little bit of a roster shakeup. So let's start there. Greg, the latest with Penn State's coaching staff and Danny O'Brien. What's the situation with Penn State as they're tweaking some things heading into fall camp?
Yeah, so I think obviously most Penn State fans know that Dwayne Scott, who was formerly a GA on the offensive line, left for Pittsburgh, and they brought in a man by the name of Kevin Say to take his job. And then they moved David Parker, who was a graduate assistant on offense and focused on the quarterbacks, moved him into an analyst role, and then moved Danny O'Brien, who's been here for a couple years now. And Penn State fans should know that name, not only because he's been here for a few seasons, but also because he was recruited by the Lions back during the Bill O'Brien days. Actually played for James Franklin at Maryland and was leaving there, ultimately finished at Wisconsin, but they moved him into a graduate assistant role. So Nate, I know Sean's been pretty high on this move. Sean Fitz, of course, and T. Frank, I know you have been as well. And I think that ultimately it gives another set of ears, eyes, and literally hands for Mike Yurcich to work with when you're talking about quarterback development at a time when they're not just debuting, in all likelihood, Drew Aller as a starter, but also developing Bo Prabula, developing Jackson Smolik, and working on, recruiting future classes. So this just gives him a little bit more of a visible role and a little bit more of an opportunity to work with guys on the field. And I think that can only help, especially when you're talking about, obviously, one of the more important positions on the field. Mike Yurcich spends a lot of times at practice with those quarterbacks, but there are times he has to go on and do some other things. And when you have someone like Danny O'Brien in town and around to help fill those gaps, I think it's only going to help on practice days and game days.
Yeah, Nate, what do you think? Anything you want to add there about how this changes anything for O'Brien and the Penn State quarterbacks? I know from a lot of praise coming his way for the work he's done. We've had Brad Mandler here on the show that's talked about how he's an integral part of what Penn State does from a recruiting perspective. Yeah. But from his role with the team, like anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that he has this deep kind of lasting relationship. He goes way back with Franklin. And so I think that is a big part of this. I mean, he's a guy, like, I think at one point was living above James's garage. I don't remember exactly the circumstances there, but I think early in his process, when he first arrived as an analyst at Penn State, that was a role that where he lived for a little bit. So no, I think to have a guy that you trust there that is considered kind of a rising star in this profession, it only helps. It only helps Penn State, and certainly something that, as Fitz explained in the original reporting, is creative. It's a creative move on Penn State football's part to get him implemented in that role, but one that I think that they feel like will produce dividends for them.
It's also one side note is it does start a clock for him, right? You can only be a GA for so long, and then you have to move on to a different position, correct? So does that change anything in the timeline or kind of in the way Penn State looks at that position with him, or is this just I know there's some rules changes this offseason that kind of go into all of this stuff, but how does the clock with Danny O'Brien change maybe the future for Penn State in any way? Either of you have a thought about that?
Yeah, I mean, basically, you can be a GA for 2 years unless you meet a certain type of criteria as it relates to how many credits you take and things like that. Then you can get a third. Obviously, it got a little bit muddy. Deion Barnes, clearly a good example, a guy who got an extra year because the NCAA gave GAs an extra year, just like they gave players an extra year due to COVID. But yeah, 2 years is standard, 3 years if you take enough credits. But most guys, I think, Nate, you would agree, you've been doing this a long time. Most guys after 2 years are ready to move on, either into a bigger job elsewhere on field, or as we've seen now with David Parker, maybe into an analyst role. So I really don't think you're going to see too many guys, Daniel Bryan included, want to be a GA for 3 years. But if you take the right number of credits and things like that, you certainly can qualify for that extra year if you want it.
Yeah, it's interesting. The future, is he a guy that Penn State is targeting as if Mike Yurcich moves on, is there an internal plan of replacement, or is it all of those chess pieces you set them up early and then hopefully we find out later? But that's all to be determined. Nate, you got something there?
No, I was just gonna say. I mean, it feels like the way that these things change on a dime. It's like projecting that far into the future feels foolhardy to me to a certain extent. Just given the fact that you're coming out of a situation with Manny Diaz in particular, who like opened the job, got fired on a Friday and was hired on Saturday, right? Like. Right. So like, what's the succession plan at offensive coordinator or quarterback coach or what have you? Like, who knows? Like, call me the day that Mike Yurcich takes another job.
Yeah. It's just identifying talent, putting guys in position to succeed. Sure. It's not just a football thing on the field thing. These are also some of the moves that James Franklin has been very good at and has had good foresight previously. So just kind of examining those for the future. But you're right, Nate. If there's one thing I am, it is absolutely foolhardy. But Nate, know the other thing? You know the other thing about BWI that I really love?
What's that?
You know what it is?
No.
It's that this is a premium item. Like, we work on some excellent content, and we want to be associated with excellent things. And now we can add excellent apparel to the mix. Birddogs.com. They are the latest sponsor of the BWI Live Show here on Monday, and I'm currently wearing a pair of Bird Dogs myself. These are, they sent them in the mail this weekend, and the first time I put them on, I went, oh, this is what I've been missing when it comes to clothing, because these are some premium items. If you're looking for something you want to buy once and then have a piece of really nice clothing, check out birddogs.com. They want us to show you the pants and everything. Here's the problem is, like, I've tried multiple times to stand up in the shot. It's ridiculous. It's not going to work. I will work on that, getting you some live action shots of our products here from Bird Dogs. That's coming up. But what I can tell you right now is if you use the promo code BWI, birddogs.com/BWI, you'll get a free Yeti tumbler with your purchase. And I got it here. These things are super nice. I love ice water. I love, like, freezingly cold ice water. I like putting ice in a can or in one of these and a little bit of water and leaving it for a couple hours and letting it just kind of become iceberg water. These things are amazing, and they look cool. You're going to look good. And, of course, if you use promo code BWI, you get the free Yeti tumbler. These are awesome. We're going to be telling you about more in the future. We're going to talk about it more in the future. But right now, I'm happy to introduce birddogs.com as the latest sponsor of the BWI Live Show. And again, use the promo code birddogs.com/BWI. You can find that in the description of the show so that you can use that promo code and get your free Yeti tumbler with the only shorts, the only pants you're going to want to wear ever again. Guys, NIL also in the news with James Franklin tweeting out recently. Nate, you wrote about this. Is this a coincidence? The timing of early July recruiting decisions happening all around Penn State, maybe some of them not going their way. Is this all connected?
I don't know about that. I think that look, let's be honest. James Franklin has been displeased with Penn State's NIL efforts for 3 years, right?
Yeah.
We're coming up on this. Like, it just started July 1. The second year, he's been displeased for 3 years. Right? So the getting ahead of it in the first place, didn't like the plan, didn't like the direction that they were going. And I think that some of his premonitions and fears have played out as being accurate, right? I mean, they just have fallen behind, not fallen behind. They started behind and are working to play catch up. And so now what you see with this, what are we going to call it? A social media blitz, right? Last week, where he made a message and really tried to rally support. And you saw a bunch of other Penn State adjacent people, right? Whether it was former players, certainly the current coaching staff, other personnel in at Penn State, who all kind of chimed in and added on top of what Franklin was saying to provide a unified voice, I guess, of the urgency for Penn Staters to be involved in this. Look, it's super interesting, right? Right? Like I'm on
working?
the outside.
I don't know. Are all of these efforts working? Xander wants to know, had the Happy Valley United, the new collective, the super collective that is merged with all the other ones, how has it been helping NIL so far? Do you have any insight into that? And just in general, James Franklin's social media plea, Penn State trying as hard as they can to drum up support. How well are things going right now?
I mean, I think that there are some hits and some misses. Right, like the point of all of this is not. You've got multiple prongs, right? On one side, you have courting, wooing, generating support from major donors. Okay, like that's its own operation. That is absolutely plugged in and doing things that I think are beneficial to Penn State. They've had some success there that they need to continue to do and get more of. But what they haven't had success with, and Happy Valley United is still, I think, getting its sea legs to a certain extent, is generating the support of the masses, right? That is the angle that Penn State has not figured out, is desperate to figure out, is getting people to see, acknowledge, and be supportive of with enthusiasm on a $10 level, right? Like the PBS telephone drive. Like that's what they're trying to get is, hey, if you pitch in $10, it's more likely that when you come to the Ohio State game later this year, Penn State will win. But they just haven't been able to get that secret sauce down. But it's something that I do think they are actively trying to be more vocal, more in your face about. And it is maybe making a little bit of a ripple in terms of the perception of fans, right? Like hearing it, like acknowledging it.
I'm sorry, you lost me halfway through because I was just imagining like, and first down support for Penn State football is brought to you by you. $10 support here, like just in the most NPR voice I can't even do it right. You have to have that voice to do. I want one of those playing during the whiteout game. Is first downs support. You can text your support to the NIL collective. But it really is like a huge thing for Penn State football. James Franklin talked about it on Adam Brenneman's podcast a few weeks ago. He's talked about it to Nate. Like this is the thing is every time he talks about it, Nate, we have to discuss it here on the show, but it's not really anything new. It's just the continued push forward. It's just the never-ending pursuit of more for the NIL, right?
Yeah. Well, when you're starting from nothing, more is necessary. I don't think it's not a situation where, well, things are going pretty well, but if we really work on it, like it could be better. No, this is, hey, like begging, screaming, pleading, like pounding on the window, like help us. That is, I think, more akin to what is happening right now in terms of Penn State's push to get, again, it's like a twofold thing. There is getting the donation in the first place, but there's a bigger fish to fry, which is enthusiasm. Getting people to not just like begrudgingly give a couple of bucks, but to like take pride in it. It has not happened for Penn State football. It's something that did happen with Penn State basketball at the end during its March, right? Its March push.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, they raised a bunch of money just through fan nickel and diming. That is something that worked for them. And if it can work for Penn State basketball, who has a niche fan base, it can definitely work for Penn State football. They just have to be able to figure out how to do that and get people on board.
Speaking of Penn State basketball, we'll get back to that in just a second. But Greg, I want to tag you in here, talk about some things that are going on in Penn State wrestling. Bo Nickal is making a move in UFC. What value does that bring to Penn State wrestling in terms of they're already the number one team? They are the top program in wrestling in America, but having a very famous former player in any sport generally helps with your program building. How much with UFC in particular does that kind of have an effect on the wrestling team? And just generally, what are your thoughts on how he's been progressing in UFC?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, I mean, obviously it doesn't hurt, but the biggest thing is, Penn State wrestling gets guys who could be starters in the Big Ten or anywhere nationally, and it gets them to come in and wait 2 or 3 years to get onto the map because they have so much talent ahead of them. But those guys just want to learn from Cody or Cale Sanderson and Cody Sanderson and Casey Cunningham and so on. And the list goes on and on. So you get a lot of guys who the place just recruits itself. But look, I mean, Bo Nickal's success, a lot of college wrestlers now, high school wrestlers now remember the success he had at Penn State, and it doesn't hurt. He's a good spokesperson for Penn State. He brings up Penn State on multiple occasions, whether it's post-fight interviews, pre-fight interviews. He certainly is not shy about where his roots are, where he comes from, and I think that undoubtedly helps. Now, again, does Penn State need much help recruiting in the wrestling space? No, but it any little bit helps, especially in this day and age. So he's had a great start to his career. He's unbeaten so far. He just won another match in the first round by a knockout in 38 seconds over a guy who was previously undefeated, but probably no match for him, Nickal, in the first place. So he's cruising right along, and there's a lot of guys I think who, if anything else, I think it shows, if guys are worried about it, that you can go from college wrestling at Penn State to the UFC and have a platform and shine. And he's not, of course, the first guy to make waves either internationally, nationally, in UFC, and just wrestling in general. So I think it helps Penn State for sure. And, obviously the more, the bigger platform he gets and the more he talks about Penn State and his experience there, it undoubtedly can't hurt. But they do such a good job on the front end as it is that, I think the impacts of it probably aren't as great as it might be for a Saquon Barkley to, show people what Penn State running back can do or something like that.
People love it when we talk about wrestling here on the show. So I know we're in the off season, but any other news or notes, nuggets you want to give about the team before we get onto a couple other things here in the news and notes section?
Yeah, no, not really. I mean, I think obviously probably some Penn State fans have seen that the Olympic sports are hiring some assistant coaches. They're allowed to, I think almost every sport in the Olympic sports, maybe except for basketball. Nate, correct me if I'm wrong for that, but could add another coach this offseason. So we'll see what they do there. I would guess they're just going to promote Jimmy Kennedy, who's currently the quote unquote volunteer assistant coach, to the assistant coach job, but we'll see. One thing, Pan American Championships were this past weekend, U20, Mitchell Westenbrink, who's coming to Penn State as a transfer from Cal Baptist. He won the 74 kilogram title in the competition was in Chile. And then Luke Willowdahl, the class of 2024 commit, won the 57 kilogram. Neither one of those guys, I believe, gave up a point. Now, they both were unbeaten in the weight on the route to a title and did not give up a point during the 4 matches for Willowdahl and 3 matches for Westenbrink. So, more international success for guys either currently at Penn State or coming to Penn State, which, again, it's kind of become par for the course over the last number of years, decade really, and even before that. So things are moving right along. It's soon going to be time. I think we'll start seeing some scheduling info come out soon. And before we know it, the season will be here.
Yeah, fall is way closer than you imagine because once you get on the football train, like the news never stops. Fall sports are here. We'll cover all of that, including Penn State basketball. Nate, we're coming back to you. Big week ahead for Penn State basketball. We were also going to have a Hoops podcast coming up Wednesday night, 7 p.m., so make sure you tune in for that. Nate and I are talking about basketball. We'll have it wherever you get your podcast. But give us a preview. What's coming up this week with Hoops?
Yeah, it's not a big week for them necessarily, but it is a big week for us. Penn State is giving access to the media to an open workout, right? This is the 4th week of 8 that they have over the off season, where Penn State's able to work out as a full team. And since everybody got to campus, I think it's 4 hours a week over 4 days a week that they can do organized on court instruction. So this is valuable time. I mean, this is really how you have to cram in. It's a cram session before the start of the season when you have 10 new pieces to the program. So that is on Tuesday this week. They're going to have a Mike Rhodes press conference. It's his first press conference since, I want to say, Coaches versus Cancer that he had at the beginning part of June. And even, I mean, being honest, before that, his prior only interaction with the media has been his introductory press conference. So there's a lot to talk about.
We're still settling in. We're still getting to know you phase for a lot of people with the new basketball coach.
They had a lot of stuff to do for sure. I mean, it's been a heavy lift early in the process for them. So yeah, opening things up a little bit this week should be interesting.
Nate, you'll be on site for the baseball introductory press conference, right? Did I hear that correctly, or no? Or are you going to have to be?
There's a real possibility of that, but the comment section is going to have to really clamor for it for me to fully be on board.
Do you want Nate to be reporting to you live about baseball tomorrow? Please drop that in the comments. Along with, by the way, the BWI Mailbag coming up in just a little bit. We're relying on you to give us some good questions here in the chat. So please like the video if you're watching at this point, talking about all the nuances, all the ins and outs of Penn State basketball, football, wrestling, and we're going to get to our top 5 under-the-radar players coming up in just 1 second. But drop your questions, comments in the chat, and we'll be getting to those at the end of the show. Also, something that we need to talk about. Nate, your favorite thing is back. Your favorite thing. Tixman Gym.
Oh,
man. You know the season is here when we're talking about getting your tickets. Have you been looking for a reliable source of Penn State football tickets? Nate, can you sing the chorus for me? I'm just kidding. I'm doing this read. Tixmangym.com. That was awful. Formerly PSUTixman.com has been running his ticket exchange in Wilmington, Delaware for over 25 years. Every buyer is handled with courtesy, respect, and every ticket purchased is guaranteed. So, proceeds are used to fund the PSU AA Chapter Scholarship Fund and the PSU Levi Lamb Fund for athletic scholarships. At least it was last year. I need to get updated copy to make sure that's correct. Get your 2023 season tickets now. Tixmangym.com or email jim@tixmangym. Call 302-521-8380. That's tixmangym@gmail.com. So we are just right on the edge of Penn State football because we've got all kinds of great stuff coming up, including getting you to the game. Coming up this week, though, super excited about this. We've been working on this for a while now. And friend of the show, Curtis Jacobs, who has requested to come on the show, we're making that happen. That's coming up Thursday at 7 p.m. He is going to be live here on the BWI YouTube show with us. So we're going to be talking to him. We're going to be having a conversation. But here's the deal. I wanted to make this a live event so that you want to get you want to have an interaction with a Penn State football player, join us 7 p.m. on Thursday. We will be taking some select questions from the BWI live chat here on the show, and we'll be talking to Curtis about his offseason, his presumed final season at Penn State, and much more. So make sure you put it on your calendar, 7 p.m. Thursday, our live show with Curtis Jacobs. Okay, I think we got everything out of the way in terms of news and notes for the week because we need to get to our new fun segment here, another top 5. Today, we are looking at the top 5 under-the-radar Penn State football players heading into the 2023 season. It's a big year. It's not just going to be superstars that drive everything going on with the Nittany Lions. They are going to need to be supported by a full team effort. So we have a dueling top 5 list each. We'll be hitting the sound effect and going around the horn, starting with Nate, going to Greg. I'll finish up. So here we are. All that set up. Here's number 5.
Number 5.
Nice.
What?
You guys haven't had the top 5 sound effects yet?
Oh.
No.
No?
Good one for me. Yeah.
Oh, man, it's a staple here on the show.
Wow.
I guess it's just when I'm riding solo, we use it more often. But anyway,
Right.
Nate,
I love
what
it.
you got for me?
First of all, can I just say I'm intrigued that none of us overlapped. We didn't have There were no overlapping players. Was that planned? Did you guys see what I said?
No, the only one that I had that I was going to put down, but by luck and chance I didn't, was your number 5, and then I moved on.
All right. Well, then I'll chime in. Daquan Hardy is my number 5, and he's a guy that got picked on, I think, a little bit at the beginning of last season and was not in the consciousness of a lot of Penn State fans, or he was an easy GOAT, I would say, early in the season.
Yeah.
Even it's not like they were losing games because of him, but he had a couple of plays that he gave up. No, I think Penn State loves him. I think he is a crucial part of what Manny Diaz does. Yeah, I think he's going to have a big year. And I think not only is he going to have a big year, but I don't think enough people are really talking about him or considering him in that part of the equation of what they bring back with Kalen King and Johnny Dixon. Like Johnny Dixon and Kalen King deserve all the hype in the world, no question about it. But Daquan Hardy, I think, is a big piece of that does not get mentioned the way that he should.
Yeah, I wrote about him last week talking about the Better or Worse series over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. By the way, great reason to sign up is to get all exclusive content over there, including premium articles. Daquan was a part of that corner conversation of they returned 3 starters that are really good. And I think you make a great point about how kind of he had an up and down season last year, another year. But the outside corners really stole the show last year, and he kind of took a step back. But if you remember early in his career, he was a standout player for Penn State at that position. Greg, moving on to you. Who do you have?
Yeah. So Daquan Hardy almost made my top 5. I'm glad we didn't have any overlap though. But my number 5 was Tyler Dusansky, which is a shout out.
I don't
to
have a
Fitz more than
photo of
anything
him.
else.
Sorry,
that's okay. We'll get one. But no, I have him on my list simply because I don't know if it's fair to call a first time starter underrated, but I think it's going to be an underrated role he plays this year because we're spending. I agree 100% that we don't spend enough time talking about Daquan Hardy in that cornerbacks room. And kind of on a similar note, we don't spend enough time, I think, talking about the fact that Penn State is replacing its long snapper, its holder, its kicker, its kickoff specialist, its punter, and it's going to need a new punt returner, and it might need a new kick returner too. So if you think you're relying on the offense to score a lot of points, which it should, and the defense to keep points off the board, which it should, the one potentially underrated downfall of this team could very well be special teams. And I think that when you start with Dusansky, you have one guy that you can rely on. So maybe not so much an underrated player, but I think he's going to have an underrated role on this team this year.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. That it's also a hard one to know. That's a hard position to know. But when you have that transition at long snapper, it's really important. I'm going in with Tyler Elsdon, missing from spring football. There's always going to be buzz about the Penn State Mike linebacker situation with Abdul Carter on the team. And what's the future there? Do they want X, Y, or Z to happen? Last year, Tyler Elsdon filled the role. Kobe King filled the role, but he's been very quiet, not being a part of spring football. So where is he in his development this offseason? What are the reasons? We can assume the reasons why he wasn't available this offseason. Did that put him behind the 8 ball? And how does that Mike linebacker position work itself out? Are there now 3 players that are rotating at the linebacker position, or is it going to be like it was last year with King and Elsdon sharing snaps there? So that competition never ended, and whether or not he plays full time, whether or not he is the starter, or if he's a co-starter, I think that's a huge part of that conversation. Let's get to number 4.
Number 4.
All right, Nate, where are you going to number 4?
I'm sticking with where you were at. It's actually a perfect segue. I'm gonna go with Kobe King. I think that Kobe King is a guy who got better last year. I don't think that was really debatable. Right from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, he was a better player. He got more comfortable. He made more plays. Right. I mean, it's interesting. Sometimes I think the conversation is about when guys make mistakes. And that gets a lot of attention, but productivity is maybe a bigger element to this than is making, like, you can live with some mistakes, right? You don't want backbreaking mistakes. You can live with some mistakes, but if you're on the field on that defense, you got to be making plays. Like, you got to be part of the conversation. You got to do more than just tread water. And I think that was a thing that Kobe was able to do towards the end of last season that really should propel him into this season to be a bigger factor, more of a part of the conversation of what they need there at that Mike spot.
Yeah, is that something, Greg? Is that something that you're looking at too? Of what's the future of the Mike linebacker position?
Yeah,
that Penn State's staff usually likes continuity in terms of we're not going to replace a starter unless it's clear and obvious. Do you think that we're in that territory when it comes to the Mike linebacker position? Because fans, it's an undoubted, undeniable thing that Abdul Carter is going to be the starting Mike linebacker, but I never will say absolutes when it comes to this staff. So what do you think in terms of how big of a deal is this?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that, look, obviously, if you're breaking down the snap counts, I think you're going to see Abdul Carter and Curtis Jacobs lead the way there, obviously. And anytime Penn State goes sub package, that's the way it's going to be. But yeah, I don't think that has to mean either that there's just no role at all for Kobe King and Tyler Elsdon. So the thing that I just have to question is, I just wonder what that rep count's going to look like. How far ahead did Kobe King put himself or not put himself during a spring practice where he had that spot all to himself? I think that really is probably the biggest question here. But moving forward, then Penn State's obviously going to have to figure out, who it wants to use in what situations, and how many situations can it afford to just have two linebackers on the field. So we'll see there. But certainly I think that's going to be a very interesting position battle to watch.
Where are you going with number 4 on your list?
Yeah, I went with Hunter Norzad, and the only reason I did that was I did a podcast last week talking about Penn State and the Big Ten, and the host of it was talking about, Penn State getting Norzad to come in this year to play center, kind of completely forgetting that he was already at Penn State last year. And I do think he's a pretty overlooked part of this offensive line. Obviously, the conversation is always going to start and end with Olu Fashanu. There's no doubt about that. We know Caden Wallace, he's been here a long time. Sal Wormley, Landon Tangwall at the guards. JB Nelson, Vega Ione getting some love recently. But Hunter Norzad's kind of the forgotten guy that's going to be the one. This kind of goes back almost along the line to Duzansky, but he's going to have an underrated role for this team because it needs to be a big one. They've been pretty good in terms of having reliable center play over the last few years. We assume they have one here, but this is his first time playing center. Remember, he was a tackle in the Ivy League. Comes to Penn State and plays guard. They got him some valuable snaps last year at center late in games. And I think it's a transition that's going to work well. They claim he's very fast and things like that. So there's no reason for me not to think it's going to work. But I do think he's a forgotten about guy and not talked about a lot as someone who touches the ball literally every single Penn State offensive snap.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point that when we talk about the offensive line, there's a lot of names and competition on the interior. But one guy that right now there's no real competition for is Norzad. I'm going to go, and I'm going to cheat here, and I'm going to name 2 players, and that is Liam Clifford and Caden Saunders. Basically, just the slot situation at Penn State, because I think both these guys have proven that they're good players. Last year, we got to see a lot more of Clifford than we did of Saunders, but Saunders looked good in the blue-white game. But that just the roadblock. The situation at receiver where you've got Keandre Lambert-Smith most likely moving primarily into the slot. What does that do for these two guys? What's their role with the team? How much depth and assistance can they provide? And are they going to see snaps? Because I think they're both players on the rise, but if they're not better than the guys ahead of them, they're not going to see as many snaps. So just that particular situation with these 2 players I find fascinating, because you've got a bit of a glut there at the slot and you have a demand for guys on the outside. And I think that's really the problem with the competition in this spring with Penn State's receivers, is that, just out of balance. You don't have as many guys that you feel comfortable with on the outside unless you move Keandre Lambert-Smith out there part-time. And, overall they probably have the bodies, but what they want to do and what's the best practice, I think that kind of logjam there, I'm interested to see how that plays out and what they do if those guys can get snaps on the field. Move on to number 3 so we can get through all these, because there's some good conversations ahead. Let's get to it.
Number 3.
By the way, if you want to give us your 5 underrated players. Throw them in the chat, or if you're watching here on replay, leave a comment with your top 5 under-the-radar players for Penn State football this fall. Nate, give us number 3. Lead us our leadoff hitter here.
Khalil Dinkins. It's
All right.
it's the Theo Johnson and Tyler Warren show at tight end, and that's good and well. But I think that Khalil's going to play this year, and I think he's a player who is capable of making a contribution for Penn State. I mean, look, Tyler Warren was number 3 last year, right? Yeah. And he had that reputation and caught touchdowns, right? He was a guy who made some plays for Penn State. I think that type of an impact is very, very much possible for Khalil this season.
You know what's really interesting is like they're so used to gigantic Penn State tight ends, 6'5", 6'6". You know, Theo Johnson and Tyler Warren are massive. Dinkins, receiver sort of player at tight end, and I'm just like, is he big enough to play? But he's the tight end size. Like he's just not the extreme jumbo version. So Greg, give us your thoughts here, follow up on Khalil Dinkins, and then hit us with your number 3 player.
Yeah, so I think Dinkins is a really interesting pick because Penn State, we know, like you said, Nate, Theo Johnson and Tyler Warren are going to lead the way there, assuming both are healthy. But they've used a third tight end for pretty much the entirety of Mike Yurcich's time here. And even Kirk Ciarrocca's 1 year, he was willing to rotate guys. And even though that season was so strange, it's not necessarily the best one to point back to. But yeah, to me, I think Dinkins has every right to be a guy who finds his way into the rotation this year. And maybe he doesn't play more than, 15 or 20% of the snaps this year, but he should have a role. So I think that's a good pick. My third pick is Keaton Ellis. Penn State obviously returns one safety starter, needs another one. But, here's a guy that has played a lot of football at Penn State. And from all intents and purposes, if you listen to James Franklin, if you listen to Anthony Poindexter, he's ready to take another step forward and maybe have his best season yet. So they named him a captain. I think that said a lot coming out of spring practice. And, again, we talk about Kalen King all the time. We talk about Abdul Carter, and with good reason, Chop Robinson and Adisa Isaac. But Keaton Ellis, to me, is a guy that if he's actually taking the steps forward that they claim he is, will have every opportunity to be a highlight reel player this fall and be a very solid and reliable piece of Manny Diaz's defense in the back line.
Yeah, Nate, you and I talked a little bit about that safety position earlier. Your thoughts on Keaton Ellis, veteran of the group? Is it a breakout year for him, do you think?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I really do. I honestly think that the captain pick came as a little bit of a surprise, I think, to some of us. But he's been the steady presence back there, whether people are talking about him or not. And the transition for him is this spring that he made some plays. He became a playmaker for them in the spring. At one point was their interceptions leader. And so if that is something that he can do and maintain through this season with that veteran leadership, I mean, Manny Diaz really, really praised him in the interview that I had with him. So I just think that there's a lot of potential there for Keaton to have a great year as a guy who, isn't necessarily the sexy pick going into the season.
Yeah, I'll give you a non-sexy pick as well, although Penn State fans love the offensive line. Coming in for me here, number 3 is J.B. Nelson, because we talk a lot about Landon Tangwall, that left side, but everything we've heard is J.B. Nelson is going to be part of this conversation. He's going to play, so Penn State has depth at guard. I've just been saying, I know that Landon Tangwall went through the offseason. He was part of the spring game. But, when you're recovering from an injury, it's not the same in terms of your ability to develop and get back to where you were previously. Doesn't mean you can't have a great season. It just means that is a factor that we have to account for this offseason. And J.B. Nelson, on the flip side, has been putting in a lot of work. He looked great the last time we saw him at the Penn State Lift for Life camp, the Lift for Life charity event. So I'm just curious as to how that split of reps at the left guard position is going to happen. And I know Nelson is a backup tackle as well, so is he going to see some snaps there on the outside? What is his role with being a swing player, and how does he factor into that lineup? Because, they're going to get him reps. Just how many and where, I think, are interesting. Any last thoughts there before we get to number 2?
Definitely a guy to keep an eye on this year, but that offensive line situation inside specifically is going to be interesting for sure.
Yeah. Do we have any more of that coming up? No, nobody else. The offensive line is done. Let's get on to our top 2 in our under the radar players for Penn State.
Number 2.
The week off. Whew, I am rusty. Top 5 under the radar players. We're coming in at number 2. Nate, who do you have for us?
I have Zariah Fisher, and he is at a position that I think demands it in a certain respect. I mean, there's a lot of hype, warranted hype for those top 3 guys, but James Franklin has been saying it really all spring and into the summer that that you need 4, and really you need 5. So who are those 4th and 5th going to be? Amin Vanover certainly is part of the conversation. I know people like Smith Vilbert there, but to me, it's going to be Zariah Fisher. I think he's going to be that 4th guy in that rotation. He's a guy who can create splash plays, which again they love. Right. And so if you have that at that position, I think it really gives you an opportunity to get on the field in certain circumstances. And obviously Zariah's an older guy who's been through a lot at Penn State, but it's a good opportunity for him, and one I think that he'll take advantage of this year.
Greg, who do you have here at number 2?
Well, so I'm going to change my pick because we did have some overlap, but that's okay. We're going to keep ourselves honest and not say that Zariah Fisher was my number 2 as well. So I'm going to go with Devon Lees. Yeah, that's okay. I think that's a really good pick on Fisher. I think that he's a guy that now that he's supposedly going to be completely healthy, will have every opportunity to really shine, I think, in this defense. And again, not as a starter in all likelihood, not as a guy that's going to play starter like reps, but in pass rush situations, I really think he has a chance to be special this year, maybe more so than most Penn State fans realize. So I will change my mind. I'll go with Devon Lees. The guys that played a lot of football at Penn State is going to have to be kind of the man in the middle. Maybe not that PJ Mustipher was, or at least not the same way or style. But here's a guy that's played a ton of football at Penn State, especially last season. I think he's often overlooked when we talk about the strengths of this defense, and I think that probably should be changing and will change certainly by the time September ends, if not before it even begins. So that's my pick there. I don't have the stats in front of me right now, but I just thought he had a nice year last year. I thought he was a reliable guy. Does he need to take a step forward just like so many other players on this roster? Yeah, of course. But, a guy that I think probably deserves a little bit more respect than what he generally gets.
I'm going to go to the secondary. I'm going to go on the flip side of what Nate said earlier, and that's going to be kind of a theme here to end the show, is I'm going to go Jalen Reed. I'm curious. This is what I don't know about this fall. How are they going to use their safeties? Who's going to play where? Because you talk about Keaton Ellis being a playmaker. You can make plays from any part of the field, but the defense can set you up to have more opportunities depending on your position. So, how it would make sense to me, Jalen Reed, who we didn't see in the spring because of the injury in the Rose Bowl, and KJ Winston playing that boundary position. You're closer to the line of scrimmage. You play in the run game a little bit more, but typically the veteran safety, the leader of the team, the guy you trust the most, he gets some snaps at that position as well in the Penn State defense. How does that work out with Reed and with Keaton Ellis? Because that is going to dictate a lot of what happens in the secondary with, rep counts, where players are. Jalen Reed, I think, struggled a little bit last year in coverage, especially when he had to be in single coverage or in zone coverage on the field side. So has he taken a step there? Has he had the offseason to be able to do that? The safeties are good, but replacing Tig Brown is hard because replacing instincts to catch the football in the secondary, nobody has caught as many interceptions as Tig Brown did in 2 seasons under James Franklin. The closest was Zamani Oruwariye getting 8 over 3 seasons. So that's hard to replace. Can those guys do it? It's going to kind of, now I'm talking generally about the secondary, but Jalen Reed and how he fits in the picture, how they make those snap counts work, that's something I'm curious about this fall. Any thoughts? A last call before number 1.
No, I mean, I think it's a good pick, and that safety room, I guess that's not really good podcasting. But yeah, so at this point, I just think that safety room is so interesting because you're right. I think it's probably, if you're talking about underrated concerns, period, to me, the biggest one is easily the safeties. And how do you replace Tig Brown? Because like you said, T. Frank, he did so much for this defense last year, and it's not going to be just one guy who does it for Penn State.
Got a couple questions in the chat. We'll have a quick BWI mailbag coming up after number 1.
Number 1.
Nate, you are first up. Who do you have as your number 1 player that's under the radar?
Yeah, I didn't want to talk about Jalen Reed because I was so excited to talk about Omari Evans. He's the guy who I think, honestly, Dante Cephas has been at the forefront, I think, of everybody's minds since he decided to transfer to Penn State, and I think that is warranted. There's no argument against that, but I do think that something happened this spring with Omari that changed the conversation. It upended the dynamic a little bit where Cephas is going to have a role and he's going to have an opportunity this season. But Evans is a guy who made a play in the spring that will allow him to see the field and be a more active part of what they're doing there at the receiver position in the fall. I mean, it's maybe even starting, right? I don't know that anybody would have projected that in January or December last year, but like now, yeah, I think that's a real possibility for him. And he's a guy who, I mean, he certainly has to go do it, right? He has to put that into action on the field, but he's going to have an opportunity that I'm not sure most people really recognize is there in front of him.
Just quickly a follow-up here. This is something I've been struggling with. Is James Franklin said basically the last week and a half of spring ball, he turned things around. We moved him into that position, were his words. And I don't want to parse them out into too small to miss the meaning here of generally Omari took a step at the end of camp. But is that enough? He kind of backtracked a little bit later saying, like, on a different podcast, I like what we saw, not ready to declare anything yet, but I like what we saw. Like, is it enough with Omari Evans, what you saw, to make these projections for next fall that he is going to take that step and do those things? Like, where do you land on the vibe meter with Omari Evans?
Certainly not today, right? Like, it's not a today thing where you can say, oh, this is absolutely going to happen. But is there more of a shot? Like, yeah, I would call it even footing. Right? Mm-hmm. He's got just as good of a chance of anybody else as being part of that starting lineup after Keandre, right? And Trey Wallace. You know that those two guys are going to start, but who's the third? I think that he is positioned quite well to compete this preseason and win that job.
Well, Greg, speaking of, who's your number 1 player that's under the radar this fall?
Yeah, I went with Trey Wallace, and kind of a lot of the reasons Nate pointed out, too. I mean, I think it's fair to say that we came into the spring saying that, all right, Keandre Lambert-Smith will be the guy. Penn State needs him to be the guy. But who is the number 2 guy? And who is the number 3 guy? And who is the number 4 guy? And at this point, clearly Trey Wallace has established himself as that number 2 guy. So, we have spent, I think the reason I go with him as underrated is we have just spent so much time this offseason talking about Malik McClain when he transferred in for spring practice and Dante Cephas when he got here for summer workouts. And we're kind of overlooking, I think, or overshadowing the fact that Penn State has an extremely athletic and fast receiver already on its roster in Trey Wallace, and Omari Evans fits that bill as well. So I just think that while, as usually is the case, right, a lot of attention's put on transfers and new guys that get here and things like that. And there's, I get it. That happens all the time. But I think it is important to point out that these 2 guys who are coming back, that Nate and I just covered here, Evans and Wallace, really, I think throughout the spring have put themselves in position to not just be another receiver on the roster, but one of the 2 or 3 top guys on the roster. So I think that those 2 guys should probably be getting a little bit more recognition. And obviously that could change if Dante Cephas comes in and just kills it in preseason camp, but time will tell there.
Yeah, and I think you're right. One of those 2 guys has to step up for Penn State football this fall. There's nothing. There's no way for Penn State to get where it wants to go if they don't have one of those deep threats that turns it on and becomes, something that can balance out the offense. I'm going to go to round us out. Number 1 player on my list is Amin Vanover. And it's just like he's under the radar because, like Zariah Fisher, he's buried behind 3 future NFL players. And here's the thing. He can be a starter in the Big Ten on a bunch of different defensive lines. He's going to be the 4th guy. And I think that his disruption per snap was as high as some of the anybody on the defense last year. He just, again, there was a bunch of super talented players in front of him. So he's going to continue his role, but I think his role can be maybe more pronounced this year as Penn State's edge rushers and he's got a little bit of that tweener vibe like Dennis Sutton. I think he can provide one-on-one play when they match him up with somebody to get to the quarterback. And that's really going to be what I'm interested in this year is what do defenses focus to try to take away from this Penn State pass rush? Do they try to take away Chop Robinson and Disa Isaac? Who's on the interior? Who's getting these one-on-ones against the worst pass blocker on the offense? Are you going to allow Amin Vanover to get those one-on-ones, or are you going to force the issue and get one of your pass rushers, including Abdul Carter? Who is going to get those opportunities, and who's going to make the most of them? Because there's so many opportunities to go around where that defensive line is just so stacked with pass rushers that it's hard to tell who's going to play and who's going to maybe take a step back this year because somebody else emerges. So those are our top fives. Leave your top five in the chat or in the comment section on the video. We're going to get to a quick mailbag, and then we're going to get to the end of the show here. We're going to the chat for our first question. Greg, this might be something for you as our social media expert. Christian Bohan noticed this, and I noticed this as well. Noticed a lot of 24 commits recruiting on Twitter. Liam Andrews got carpet bombed by tweets from his prospective classmates this coming weekend. Do you think that's an intentional thing from peer-to-peer recruiting and something that the Penn State staff is encouraging to push guys over the line?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't think that they're offended by their commits going out and doing that peer-to-peer recruiting, but I just think that, it's a sign of a healthy class, whether Penn State's pushing it, whether the recruiting department is pushing it with the kids, whether the kids are just doing it themselves. I'm not sure which is which and how much is, who gets how much credit for what. But I mean, yeah, ultimately at the end of the day, if you got enough guys who are close enough in a class and they want to all get in together and do something like this, it means a lot. I think it shows that, this group is already bonding in a way that's going to be good for Penn State football down the road. And look, I don't think social media tweets are going to end up being what decides Liam Andrews or anybody else's recruitment, but the awareness and being front of mind is never a bad thing. Penn State coaching staff can do so much, but he needs to be interested in being around the guys in the class that he would eventually join. So, I think that I think that it's only good for Penn State, whether it leads to desired or not. If I could talk, desired results or not, we'll see.
Yeah, it's a Monday. We were off last week. This is a mulligan show for me as well. So, Greg, you're not alone there. Let's move on to this question because I do think that when it comes to the recruiting stuff, it is it's interesting how those dynamics work. Is this player led? Is this encouraged by the coaching staff? Ultimately, it's all, you throw it all in the pot, and maybe it gets you across the line with one guy, maybe it doesn't. Tom asks, any Penn State basketball games connected to a football weekend like last year? Any sort of combo deals here, Nate?
Not sure yet. Waiting on the non-conference schedule portion, and the conference schedule, but waiting on the details to be released from Penn State. And at this point, I know there have been a few things that have been reported. Obviously, Penn State's taking part in, I believe, a Thanksgiving week tournament this year again, right? I mean, that's something that they've done pretty typically over the last few years, but am not aware of specifics right now in terms of like a Friday night Penn State, but you can pretty much count on that type of a thing happening there towards the end of the season.
Losey's mustache is here. Always love when Chuck Losey's mustache shows up. A little late to the party, taking off paternity leave to catch a live show and educate my girls on the amazing insights of BWI. Appreciate that we have a crowd at the Losey's mustache home. But I got to say, this normally doesn't happen, but he's been one-upped here by Kyle, who says, living in the Czech Republic, currently enjoying a day off from work, glad to catch the show live, finally. Having an international audience, I love that. I love that about YouTube. I love that about the internet. One last question here that we got from the chat before we get going. And if you got a last second one, throw your question in the chat right now. But we've got this question. How does Dante Cephas doing compared to the other wide receivers battling for the third spot? How do you gauge? We can't really gauge that right now. But Nate, you mentioned this. Like, how do you gauge the starting line for when football starts at the end of the month for camp? How do you gauge where things are in that crowded room?
Even I do think it's an even playing field there, including look like is Keandre Lambert-Smith, and I think that you brought it up earlier in the show. Is that a cemented move to the slot, right? Like, is that something that they are absolutely going to do and have it be 100% of his snaps? I would be surprised. Like, honestly, I would be surprised if that was a full-time thing for him. Is there an opportunity there to get him involved in different ways? Absolutely. It might even be the majority of his snaps, but I do think that there are some other avenues that they can explore and exploit to get some of those other guys involved. And it's going to be interesting to see how that all shakes out. But yeah, I'm sticking with the spring storyline of Keandre Lambert-Smith for sure. Trey Wallace for sure. Number 3, no, not for sure, not yet.
Yeah. How much did Cephas' situation in the transfer portal, Greg? How much did that affect this? This whole conversation heading into fall camp, because he wasn't able to enroll in December for the January period. How much did that change maybe the outlook for the fall at the receiver position, because he's arriving in the summer instead of during the winter, where he could be part of that competition in the spring?
Yeah, I think that's probably why when Nate and I picked Trey Wallace and Omari Evans as underrated guys, just because, again, Cephas has been talked about so much. He has produced at the college level, which is not something you can necessarily say about the other two. So I think that's a fair part of this conversation, but he's going to have to learn the offense. He's going to obviously take a step up into Big Ten play. So to Nate's point, it's not a guarantee that he wins the third job, just like it's not a guarantee that, one of these other guys like Omari Evans does either. So if you had him here for spring, I think we have a better read for it. But right now, all you can do is gauge what they're doing in testing and things like that. And that's obviously not pads on under the bright Beaver Stadium lights.
That is coming, though. And coming up this week, we got a great lineup. You guys have been awesome here to kick off the week, the show. You in the chat have been awesome. Thanks, everybody, for showing up for the BWI Live Show. That is it for today. For Greg Pickel and Nate Bauer, I'm Thomas Frank Carr. Don't forget, Thursday at 7 p.m., Curtis Jacobs is joining the BWI Live Show. We're going to be talking to him about this upcoming season, because that runaway train is barreling down the tracks, and it's almost here. So we're going to get his insights into Penn State football heading into a very important season for himself and for the Penn State football team. Again, that's coming up on Thursday. Make sure you check out the Wednesday recruiting show and everything else we have at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. Great time to sign up and get insider information from these two lovely gentlemen. I'm Thomas Frank Carr. We will talk to you later.